Okay, we'll begin our Bible study covering Basic Christianity by John Stott. This was written in 2008. Again, the lectures are not mine, but they're taken from the book. We're looking at part 1, Who Christ Is. And we're in chapter 4, looking at the second part of chapter 4. And the chapter is the resurrection of Christ. We looked at already the claims of Christ, then we looked at the character of Christ, and now we're looking at the resurrection of Christ as evidence of who he is. Titled, The Evidence We Have. It can be summarized by making 4 statements. The body was gone, which we looked at last week. Now we're looking at the grave clothes were undisturbed. It is a remarkable fact that the accounts which say that the body of Jesus had gone also tell us that the strips of linen used to wrap the body had not gone. It is John who lays particular emphasis on this fact, for he went with Peter on that dramatic early morning race to the tomb. Remember when Mary told them that the body was gone, and both Peter and John take off running. The account he gives of this incident bears the unmistakable mark of his first-hand experience. It's in John chapter 20, verses 1 to 10. He got there before Peter, but on arriving at the tomb, he did no more than look in until Peter came and entered it. Of course, we are not surprised that Peter immediately goes in, but that's what he did, and then John follows. Finally, the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went inside. He saw and he believed. The question is, what did he see that made him believe? And as we read the Gospel of John, and as John writes, we can very quickly see that John is one who thinks deeply. We can see it by the way that he wrote the Gospel. We can see him analyzing in his mind and coming up with conclusions. And here, he saw something that made him believe. The story suggests it was not just the absence of the body. Okay, so one, of course, the body was gone, so the absence of the body, but not just that, but also the presence of the strips of linen and the fact that they were undisturbed. Okay, so absence of the body, the presence of the strips of linen that he had been wrapped in, and the fact that they were undisturbed. Let's try to reconstruct the story. John tells us that while Joseph asked Pilate for the body of Jesus, Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds, and we mentioned how expensive that is. They, taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrap it with the spices in strips of linen. This was in accordance with the Jewish burial custom. So they buried Jesus the way that the Jews were buried. Okay, they took strips of linen, they wrapped it around his body, and as they were wrapping it, they would put the mixture of myrrh and aloe into the bandages. So that is to say, as they wound the linen bandages around his body, they sprinkled the powdered spices into the folds. A separate cloth would have been used for his head. In this way, they wrapped his body and head completely, leaving just his face and neck bare, according to Oriental customs. Then they laid the body on a stone slab which had been hewn out of the side of the cave tomb. Okay. Now, supposing we had been present in the tomb when the resurrection of Jesus actually took place, what would we have seen? Should we have seen Jesus begin to move and then yawn and stretch and get up? No, we do not believe that he returned to this life. He did not recover consciousness after a faint. He died and rose again. His was a resurrection, not a resuscitation. He didn't come get his senses back and come back to this life, but it was a resurrection. It was a new body that he had. We believe that he passed miraculously from death into an altogether new sphere of existence. What then should we have seen had we been there? We should suddenly have noticed that the body had disappeared. It would have been transformed into something new and different and wonderful. It would have passed through the grave clothes as it was later to pass through closed doors, leaving them untouched and almost undisturbed. Almost, but not quite. For the strips of linen, under the weight of all the spices and the weight of itself, once the support of the body had been removed, would have subsided or collapsed and would now be laying flat. A gap would have appeared between the strips of linen used for the body and the cloth wrapped around his head, where his face and neck had been. And the head itself, and the head cloth itself, because of the complicated crisscross pattern of the bandages, might well have retained some of its concave shape, a crumbled turban, but with no head inside. And this is a drawing that shows us what it might have looked like if you looked. And if you saw something like that, you would say, hey, the body's gone, but the clothes are undisturbed, because the body came right through the clothes, which would definitely be a sign of the resurrection. If somebody stole the body, they're not going to take the clothes off and lay them that way and just take the body. They're going to take the body and the linen clothes. Okay? The body was not stolen. The clothes were still there, and they laid undisturbed. A careful study of the text of John's narrative suggests that it is just these three characteristics of the discarded grave clothes which he saw. First, he saw the strips of linen lying there. The word is repeated twice, and the first time it is placed in an emphatic position in the Greek sentence. The linen was there, it was just lying there. We might translate it, he saw as they were lying or collapsed the strips of linen. Next, the headcloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. This is unlikely to mean that it had been bundled up and tossed into a corner. It lay still on the stone slab, but was separated from the body cloth by a notable space. Third, the same headcloth was lying in its place. This last word has been translated twirled, a word which aptly describes the rounded shape which the empty headcloth still preserved. It is not hard to imagine the sight which greeted the eyes of the apostles when they reached the tomb. The stone slab, the collapsed grave clothes, the shell of the headcloth, and the gap between the two. Notice what we see, okay? They reached it, they saw the stone slab, it's empty. Then they saw the collapsed grave clothes, the shell of the headcloth, and the gap remaining between the two. This is what John saw. No wonder John saw and believed. A glance at these grave clothes both proved the reality of what had happened and indicated the nature of the resurrection. The strips of linen hadn't been touched, folded, or manipulated by any human being. Okay? They hadn't been touched, folded, or they were there as exactly as if the body would be in them, except for they had collapsed. They were like a discarded cocoon from which the butterfly has emerged. The state of the grave clothes was intended to be visible. Corroborative evidence for the resurrection is further suggested by the fact that Mary Magdalene, who had returned to the tomb after bringing the news to Peter and John, bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. And so we don't just get John's perspective. We also get Mary Magdalene, the where the body was, it's gone, and only the clothes are left there, only the linen clothes. Presumably, this means that they sat on the stone slab with the grave clothes between them. Both Matthew and Mark add that one of them said, "He is not here. He has risen just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay." Matthew 28:6, "Come, see the place where the Lord laid." And Mark 16:6, "Behold the place where they laid him. He's gone. The clothes are still there, but his body is gone." Whether or not we believe in angels, these allusions to the place where Jesus had been laid down emphasize both by where the angels were and by what the angels said, at least confirm what the gospel writers believed. The position of the strips of linen and the absence of the body were both witnesses together to his resurrection. Then the third thing then we see was Jesus was seen. So we look, we see there's no body, the body's gone. We see the undisturbed linen cloth, and then we see that Jesus was seen after the resurrection. The gospel includes some extraordinary stories of how Jesus appeared to his disciples after his resurrection. We are told of 10 separate appearances of the risen Lord to what Peter calls chosen witnesses. These witnesses were chosen so that they would be able to testify of the risen Lord. It is said that he appeared to Mary Magdalene. John 20, verses 11 to 18, Jesus appeared to Mary at the tomb. Mark 16:19 mentions Jesus appearing first to Mary Magdalene. It's interesting that he appears first to a woman, not something that a first century male writer would have chosen, right? He would have said a man. But no, Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene first. The woman returning from the tomb. Matthew 28, verses 8 and 10. Jesus meets the women, possibly including Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Salome, and Joanna, as they leave the tomb. And then Peter. Luke 24:34, the disciples say, "The Lord has risen indeed. He has appeared to Simon." 1 Corinthians 15:5. The Apostle Paul mentions Jesus appeared to Peter. The two disciples on the road to Emmaus. Luke 24:13 to 35, while Jesus walks with two disciples, one of them named Cleopas, explains the scripture and is recognized when he breaks the bread. The 10 gathered in the upper room without Thomas. Jesus appears, he shows his wounds, and he eats with them, and we see that both in Luke and John. He appears to a disciple on the evening of the resurrection day. And then the 11, including Thomas, a week later. Jesus appears again to his disciples, and Thomas is told to touch his wounds. He shows them his hands and his side, and you and I know there's very little chance that Thomas touched the Lord. He cries out, "My Lord and my God," and most probably falls down on his knees as he sees the resurrected Lord. More than 500 brothers and sisters at one time. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the resurrection chapter, Paul records that Jesus appeared to over 500 people at once. And then probably again on the mountainside in Galilee when he gave the Great Commission. In Matthew 28:16-20, he appears to the disciples in Galilee. And then James, 1 Corinthians 15:7, Paul mentions that Jesus appeared to James, his brother. And we know that James becomes a great leader in the church at Jerusalem. What changed his life? He didn't believe the whole time Christ was living, but when Christ appeared to him, he realized that it was Jesus. And his whole life changed, and he became a leader within the church. Some disciples, including Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, James, and John, by the Sea of Galilee as they were fishing. Jesus appears to the 7 disciples, leading to the miraculous catch of fish in John chapter 21, verses 1-14. And then many on the Mount of Olives near Bethany at the time of the Ascension. Luke 24:50-53, Jesus ascends from Bethany while blessing them. And in Acts, Luke ends with it, Acts begins, Jesus ascends from the Mount of Olives, and the disciples watch him go into heaven. We cannot lightly dismiss this body of living evidence about the resurrection. We must find some explanation of what these accounts are telling us. Only 3 are possible. So if we look at all that we've looked at this evening, there are only 3 ways to look at this information. First, they were inventions. They're not true, it's a lie. Second, the individuals who said they saw Jesus saw a hallucination. It wasn't an invention, it wasn't a lie, but they hallucinated. And thirdly, that their witness is true. So we have to choose one of the 3 because there really isn't anything else that we could choose. Were they inventions? There's no need to devote much space to repudiating this suggestion. The resurrection appearances cannot be deliberate inventions. For one thing, the narratives are restrained and simple. If we were the ones to write this and we were going to lie and it never had happened, you would write it with great excitement in the sense that many people saw, maybe they actually saw him come out of the grave itself, and then what the guards were trying to show that it didn't really happen. You would write something that was not restrained and simple, but our writers wrote it very restrained. For another, they are graphic and brought to life by detailed touches, not by exaggerations or things like that, but how things really were. Details that only those who saw him and were eyewitnesses would have. The story of the race to the tomb in John 20, or the walk to Emmaus in Luke 24, are too vivid and real to have been invented. Besides, if they are inventions, they're certainly not very good ones. If we had wanted to concoct the resurrection, we could probably have done better ourselves. We should have been careful to avoid the complicated jigsaw puzzle of events which the four Gospels together produce. We should have gotten rid of, or at least watered down, the doubts and the fears of the apostles. We should probably have included a dramatic account of the resurrection itself, describing the power and the glory of the Son of God as he snapped the chains of death and burst out of the tomb in triumph. But no one saw it happen, and we have no description of it. Again, we should have chosen someone with a better reputation than Mary Magdalene as the first witness. There is even a weightier object to the theory of invention than the naive simplicity of the narratives. It is an obvious fact, which we have already mentioned, that the apostles, together with the gospel writers in particular, and the early church in general, were utterly convinced that Jesus had risen. The whole New Testament breathes on atmosphere of certainty and conquest. There is no Christianity without the resurrection. Its writers may have been, if you like, tragically misled. They were definitely not deliberately misleading. If these accounts were not inventions, were the appearances themselves hallucinations? This opinion has been widely held and confidently expressed, and of course, hallucinations are not an uncommon phenomena. A hallucination is the apparent perception of an external object when no such object is present, and is associated most frequently with someone who is suffering from some form of mental ill health or some great tragedy. Most of us have known people who see things, hear voices, live sometimes or always in an imaginary world of their own. It is simply not credible to claim that the apostles were unbalanced people like this. Mary Magdalene may have been, but hardly blustering Peter or doubting Thomas. It is true that hallucinations can occur in people who are otherwise quite ordinary and normal, but such cases are usually associated with two particular characteristics. First, they happen as the climax to a period of exaggerated, willful, or wishful thinking. Second, the conditions of time, place, and mood are favorable. There must be both a strong inward desire and a sense of predisposing outward circumstances. When we look at the gospel narrative of the resurrection, however, both these factors are missing. Far from wishful thinking, it was just the opposite. When the women first found the tomb empty, they were trembling and bewildered. They fled from the scene. They were afraid. When Mary Magdalene and the other women reported that Jesus was alive, we read that the apostles did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. When Jesus himself came and stood among them, they were startled and frightened, thinking they had seen a ghost. So that Jesus rebuked them for their lack of faith and their stubborn refusal to believe. Later, Jesus appeared to the 11 as they were eating. He rebuked them for their lack of faith and their stubborn refusal to believe those who had seen him after he had risen. Luke 24, on the road to Emmaus, Jesus rebukes the two disciples. How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets had spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter into glory? Luke 24 38 and 39, when Jesus appears to the disciples in the upper room, he asks, "Why are you troubled? Why do doubts rise in your mind? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see." Jesus specifically addresses Thomas, his doubt. He says, "Stop doubting and believe." Thomas was adamant in his refusal to believe unless he could actually see and touch the nail wounds. When Jesus later met the 11 and others on a mountain in Galilee, they worshipped him, but some doubted. There was no wishful thinking here, no naive gullibility, no blind acceptance. Far from being gullible and easily led, the disciples were cautious, skeptical, and slow to believe. They were not susceptible to hallucinations, nor would strange visions have satisfied them. Their faith was grounded upon the hard facts of experience that could be verified. Not only this, but the outwardly favorable circumstances were missing too. Had the appearances all been taken place in one or two particularly sacred places, hallowed by memories of Jesus? Had those who saw him been expecting to do so, our suspicions might well be aroused. If we had only the story of the appearances in the upper room, we should have a good reason to doubt and ask questions. And yet, here we're saying that 10 or 11 are hallucinating the same thing at the same time. So I'm not even sure that's a good one. It's not hard to imagine the 11 disciples gathered in the special place where Jesus had spent some of his last hours with them. We can picture them keeping his place vacant, talking together over old times and remembering his promises to return. It's not too much of a leap to think of them beginning to wonder if he might come back after all, and then hoping that he would until the eagerness of their expectation was rewarded by his sudden appearance. But I would say that if it would only be to one or two people who were hallucinating and the rest would not see it. It would be a cruel delusion, but an understandable one. But this was not the case. Indeed, an investigation of the 10 appearances reveals a striking variety in the circumstances of person, place, and mood in which they occurred. He was seen by individuals alone, Mary Magdalene, Peter, James, by small groups, by more than 500 people together. He appeared in the garden of the tomb near Jerusalem, in the upper room, on the road to Emmaus, by the Lake of Galilee, on a Galilean mountain, and on the Mount of Olives. If there was a variety in persons and place, there was also a variety in mood. Mary Magdalene was weeping. The other women were afraid and astonished. Peter was full of remorse. Thomas of skepticism. The Emmaus pair were distracted by the events of the week. The disciples were distracted in Galilee by their fishing. Yet, through their doubts and fears, through their unbelief and preoccupation, the risen Lord made himself known to them. It is unreasonable to dismiss these appearances of Jesus as hallucinations being experienced by people with disturbed minds. So, if they were neither inventions nor hallucinations, the only alternative left is that they happen. The risen Lord was seen. And you and I can rejoice over that fact. Our faith is based on the resurrection of Christ, and the scripture is very clear. And the Holy Spirit has opened our eyes so we truly understand that Jesus Christ is risen. And we'll stop there and pick up here next week.